I can't live where I'm from. It hurts too much. So I put my hand up and volunteer to be an eternal sapling, ready to be transplanted at a moment's notice into a pot of warm soil, hoping that this time my roots will grow, that I'll be nourished by starlight, water, space, fresh air that wasn't polluted at the source. So, that was the first poem in Marina's collection, Eat the World. The poem is titled Starlight, Water, Space, Fresh Air. I'm going to give my thoughts on it in just a second, but first some quick background. Marina and the Diamonds is the stage name of Welsh performer Marina Lambrini. She often just goes by the name Marina or Marina Diamandis. Side note, I always thought it was pronounced Diamandis, but in making this video I found out it's Diamandis, and you're actually going to hear me mispronounce it even still, multiple times in this video. And that's important to note. I don't know a lot about Marina. As with pretty much all of the famous musician authors I've looked at on this channel, I haven't even listened to Diamandis' music, so I might be missing something when it comes to her poetry. But as I've said in past videos, I don't think outside reading should necessarily be a requirement to enjoy a good poetry collection. Nothing beyond some good old-fashioned literary illusions. And that's why we're here, to hopefully enjoy Diamandis' 2024 collection, Eat the World. Okay, I've actually already read the book at the time of writing this script, and surprise, surprise, I didn't love this collection. Let's get into why. Starting with the opening poem, I read it over a few times, and it feels a little underwhelming. I don't think the first page is all that bad, but the second page, like I said, just underwhelms. I feel that the poem doesn't live up to its premise. See, to me the phrase eternal sapling suggests a lot, but the poem doesn't build on that idea as much as it could. I think a much more interesting poem would spring from this idea that the speaker is a tree that can be dug up and replaced over and over again, despite how many negative surroundings it has to live through. That's an intriguing potential metaphor for a cycle of defeat, but the poem as is gives us no sense that the sapling truly is eternal. Also, notice on the second page the space between the poem's titular words, starlight, water, space, fresh air. Diamandis likes to do this sort of thing a lot. The placement of words on the page is a fun thing to play around with in poetry. It's something that poetry affords us that prose can't really. That said, the way Diamandis chooses to go about this isn't really new or interesting. This kind of thing has been done to death in postmodernist poetry. In fact, in a Q&A about the book, Diamandis listed Italian poet Ardengo Soffici as one of her influences. Here is one of Soffici's poems for reference. I can see how Diamandis is sort of trying to imitate this style, but again, she's not really breaking any new ground with her approach. But I will give her this. In one poem, she distorted a repeated phrase the more she used it, and I actually didn't hate that. It kind of spiced up the repetition at the very least. But that being said, I think this first poem is kind of representative of a lot of the pieces in the work, especially in premise versus execution. So with that in mind, I want to show you 7 more poems and mention a few others. This piece is called Pain Eraser. The things I need to write about are the things I'm scared to write about, lest they blow up my life, and everything I tried so hard to save, mend, bury, heal. So there's really not much to say about this poem. It kind of observably lacks substance. What's more, this is an idea that authors have always grappled with, and Diamandis has not approached the topic in a creative way. I've probably said this before, especially in regards to love poems, but the more covered your subject is, the more uniquely you have to approach it. There's almost an irony in this poem in the idea that writing about things is how we can heal from them, but I don't think that irony is intended and is rather something I'm imprinting onto the poem from having to look at it for so long. This is a good example of a poem that would benefit from more showing and less telling. Rather than telling us there are things that are hard to write about, why not show them to us? Then there would be some actual irony to the poem, writing about something while declaring that you can't write about it. Also, when it comes to this subject, I always have to bring up this quote from Pia Z. Earhart in the Rose Medal Press Field Guide to Writing Flash Fiction. If you've watched my videos before, odds are good you've seen this quote. It's one that's stuck with me since my first time reading the craft book. In my own stories, the load-bearing sentence is usually a line that feels like a mistake, a change in direction. Oops, how'd that get in there? The better question is, why'd that get in there? Often it's a line that embarrasses me, like flashing open your bathrobe and then, too late, covering up again, because once someone sees you naked, you can't take it back. The line presents itself. I wrote it, and now it's on the page, holding up the story. What do I want you to know about my characters that shames and frightens or exhilarates me? And how did my story go from something I wanted to tell you to something I'm afraid for you to know, but that I must now talk about? Whether we're writing stories, poetry, personal essays, whatever, I feel there should always be that element of something you're afraid for the reader to know, but something that you must now talk about. This is the vulnerability we crave from creative writing. Steve Almond talks about this a lot in his book, Truth is the Arrow, Mercy is the Bow, but I'll spare you the quote from that one as I quoted it a million times in my last video. Just kidding, I can't help myself. Here are 2 quotes. We're all the same way. We present to the world a version of ourselves brimming with assurance, free of anguish, in control. We know it's a lie, but we see everyone else participating in that lie. The result is a vast and insoluble loneliness. This is why readers yearn for the company of your doubt. We have to stop regarding our own misspent years as personal failures. Yes, we were drinking too much, ruining friendships, hurling our bodies before our hearts. Yes, we were unable to get out of bed. Yes, we got fired, got dumped, got arrested, got hospitalized. Yes, we needed help, but we were also, in the midst of all that, deeply alive. That second portion there in particular kind of reads more like a poem to me than Diamandis's. Even though those are pretty generalized examples of showing, drinking too much, ruining friendships, getting dumped, etc., they are showing nonetheless. And even the most mundane among them, being unable to get out of bed, is still proving Almond's point. Even the most mundane things we do, the things that seem like personal failures, are exemplifying the fact that we are still alive. And living with shame is still living. It is a triumph compared to giving up. And that's why we keep writing. Okay, sorry, back to Diamandis' collection. This poem feels similar in execution to the one we just discussed. Beautiful/evil. A plane cut through sky, candy apple red. A virgin Atlantic-themed bird overhead. The most beautiful/evil thing I'd ever seen. I felt sad for the birds at the top of the tree. I only ever noticed them when I was high. My life was quite good, but I wanted to die. Had no clear reasons to keep being alive. Life felt both easy and hard to survive. Okay, so in terms of form, we're working with some rhythm and rhyme here, which is nice, but do any of you also feel like the first half of this poem is far more interesting than the second half? Once we got to the last 3 stanzas, the poem becomes very declarative and not very interested in its own imagery and symbolism. As I said before, things are kind of interesting conceptually, but the execution feels off. Again, this idea of things being good but feeling depressed anyway is very common subject matter in writing. The plane sighting at the beginning of the poem is an interesting vehicle into this subject matter, and yet the poem kind of abandons it, like I said, halfway through. It's a clunky, disconnected transition. Despite how the poem opens, the piece ends up feeling uncreative and unspecific with its meaning. The speaker, kind of ironically, actually feels too detached from the event they're commenting on. I don't really see how the observation in Part A leads to the realization that is Part B. If we'd transitioned into a personal anecdote and then into our conclusion, I could forgive that a little more. As it stands, though, I just feel it's missing more of that necessary showing. The next poem is called Fizz. Much as you try, the thin fizz of desperation is a giveaway. You are not a natural, you are a trier. Trying is your way. Going for broke, only plan A. Your history is such, you will always find a way. You can adapt to anything, yet you still feel ashamed to be a trier. This poem is almost getting somewhere with its shape. I like that you can read the left-aligned lines together and they still make sense. Much as you try, you are not a natural. Trying is your way, you will always find a way. It almost reads as a contrapuntal, a type of poem you can read in separate columns or together. However, the middle and right-aligned lines don't really make sense together on their own, the way the left-aligned lines do. What's more, the poem just feels like another that's suffering from not enough showing. A much more impactful poem would have come from a showcase of attempts and failures and how those attempts create shame in the poem's you. Such showing would help us understand why the speaker still chooses to be a trier despite the ashamed feeling. Also, the title of this poem, Fizz. Does that title truly capture what the poem's about? The word fizz primed me for a much different poem than the one I actually read. Truthfully, I don't think it adds anything to the poem. It doesn't recontextualize anything or even give us a sense of orientation. I feel like Diamandis just maybe thought it was the most interesting word in the poem and chose it as the title for that reason. I feel like I've probably made my point, but I do want to show one more poem in this regard. Merman. I saw you trying to get into the Tower of Love, an underwater castle that lay in the middle of your life. You peered through the glass, face pressed up close, like a child left out of a game. Your serious expression broke my heart. It was the same one you wore in every photograph on your Hinge profile. You said you loved to have fun, but I never saw you smile, widely or freely. You tried once, when inside me, but it came out smug, like an inside joke I couldn't be a part of. You were a good person, but not a good partner. Locked in your own world, hiding underwater, protecting yourself from love. Once again, I rather like this piece on the conceptual level. Meeting a merman on Hinge, what's not to like about that as a premise? And yet, the premise kind of escapes the poem as it goes on. It still has its interesting features later on. I rather like the openness and vulnerability of the lines. You tried once when inside me, but it came out smug, like an inside joke I couldn't be a part of. Even that line break after the word inside is rather effective if you ask me. That said, the lines, you were a good person but not a good partner, are a little too on the nose for my tastes, especially when the poem isn't counterbalanced with more showing. Some snippets of this relationship would serve the poem very well. You know what else would serve the poem? Leaning into the whole merman thing, the central metaphor. I'm not even sure I completely understand why the subject is portrayed as a merman in the poem's current state. There's the whole locked in your own world, hiding underwater, protecting yourself at the end of the poem, but that feels kind of tacked on. Just to add while I'm editing here, I misspoke. Given these lines, I do understand why the subject is portrayed as a merman, and yet it feels more like Diamandis started from the merman metaphor and worked backwards. It doesn't really seem like she genuinely thought, this person acts like a merman. It seems more like she decided to label him a merman first and then come up with the reason why at the end of the poem. Granted, I obviously don't know that for certain, and of course, working backwards with metaphors is certainly a viable writing strategy, but I think Diamandis needed to do a little more legwork here to really make her specific portrayal of the merman symbol land. Okay, now back to the script as originally written. There was so much more Diamandis could have done with the imagery and symbolism of a merman. So again, this feels like a piece that's not living up to its concept. This poem too feels underdeveloped. Factory settings. My relationships hang like broken spiderwebs in the sun. Blue silver holes gape like spotlights when the wind blows. Do I try to mend the old web or build a brand new one? I'm tired of spinning though. Tired of keeping afloat, no life buoys left on the inside of my boat. Why do I make myself start over? How is this my life? How do I override my factory settings? There's a lot going on here. I actually rather like the first two stanzas. Those feel properly poetic, in my opinion. The third stanza is a little on the nose, however. I'm quite sure I've said this in my videos before, but I do often try to steer clear of rhetorical questions in poetry, as they often seem either way too broad or way too pointed. Not always the case, obviously, but like any rhetorical tool, you have to use it carefully and intentionally. The sudden departure from the spiderwebs is odd, and the rhyme of afloat and boat is quite trite. And once again, the ending feels rather tacked on. The idea of factory settings is a concept of a poem unto itself, but it's not really explored here. The ideas presented here, spiderwebs, boats, factory settings, they all feel like they need more development if they're going to be working together in the same poem. As I've briefly mentioned already, a lot of Diamandis' poems kind of trail off or abandon their initial premise as they go. I want to mention two poems here, Billionaire's Beach and Cocoon. I won't read these poems because they are a bit lengthy comparatively, and I'm scared of copyright after what happened with the Halsey video, but anyhow, both of these poems start off pretty promisingly. The first page of Billionaire's Beach is particularly poetic to my ear. It sort of loses its steam as it goes on, though. Cocoon is in a similar predicament. The poem is not without its merits, but I think it could have done with either some trimming or, conversely, some expansion of the most promising features. Now, with that, let's talk about some of the pieces I liked, at least partially. School of Life. Remember when I talked at the School of Life and in the car home how you made me cry right before I flew to New York on a red-eye, gumball red eyes, can't count how many times, fresh pink swollen face, tear ducts salinate, what a waste. You couldn't appreciate my mind, but then again they say the connections we create are mirrors of our ways, snapshot our internal state, and I've been on enough dates now to know this to be true. You need to first be the right person to bring the right person to you. So my ultimate verdict on this piece is that it's okay. It reads like a lot of poems I've read before. I think many poets attempt this prose poem stream of consciousness style, some with more success than others. As Virginia Tufte might say, the unusual syntax and absence of punctuation make the painful drama and emotional path more vivid. What's more, the experience of crying on a red-eye to New York is an interesting window. That's a snippet of show don't tell that opens doors for us as a reader. Is the ending once again too on the nose? Maybe. Will I remember this poem in a few weeks? Probably not. But is it terrible? Personally, I don't think so. I'll add this. A lot of Diamandis' poems feel kind of arbitrary and random with their line and stanza breaks. As with many celebrity collections, the breaks seem to only be in service to the aesthetic. It feels like they only serve to make the poem look like a poem. But that's not an issue in this poem since there are no line breaks. I've said this about Rupi Kaur's poetry too. It's honestly less distracting for her to write in a prose poem format, at least that's typically the case. There's another longer piece called The Sparkling Clam, which I will not read, but I will explain. In this piece, the speaker represents herself as a clam, constantly being sought after by men who just want to open her and use her for her insides. The speaker grapples with whether it's better to live safely in solitude or risk damage for a chance at togetherness. It's certainly not a perfect poem, and like many of Diamandis' pieces, it is perhaps too on the nose with its meaning, but it's decently effective in its central metaphor, more so than any of the other pieces in the book. Lastly, we have this poem, which might be my favorite in the collection. Land of Limbs. Incubator of the future, apocalyptic playground, you must love novelty to live here. Cynics do not survive. They move away to cooler climes, leave their bile behind, on sidewalks to sizzle and evaporate into clouds of vaporized dreams. Town of transplants, city of saplings, land of amputated limbs, millions of orphaned legs, hands, feet, looking to rejoin their bodies, searching to be sewn back onto where they belong. Sometimes I think, if you weren't born here, you need to be lost to live here. Or comfortable being separated from your organ of origin. I know everyone writes about LA, but I am one of her children now too. No longer an orphan, I've been adopted. No longer lost, I've been co-opted. By a town of transplants, a city of saplings, and a land of amputated limbs. So, even though this was maybe my favorite in the collection, I think it still has a lot of problems, and we'll get into them. But conceptually, I just love this visual idea of a bunch of severed limbs moving around on their own, looking for their hosts or original bodies. Part of me wishes the poem had opened with these stanzas. I also love how the poem touches on ideas of womanhood without being so explicit. For example, LA is feminized as a woman with children, the speaker being among those children. Also, at the beginning of the poem, we have the words incubator of the future, which I assume also refer to LA. In dystopian and sci-fi horror literature, women are sometimes referred to as incubators, mechanisms for nothing more than fostering the growth of eggs. This pairs nicely with the next line, apocalyptic playground, as another reference to LA. Then there's the phrase, separated from your organ of origin. Again, I think there is a potential woman-related, feminine-charged reading of that portion. More broadly, though, it kind of sounds like a person simply has to abandon their roots and their family to live in LA. With all that said, I still think Diamandis could have gone deeper here. The most obvious aspects to me would be greater description and imagery around Los Angeles and around the body parts and their movement, seeing as that's sort of the operative image in this poem. If this poem is supposed to reveal what LA does to us, I'm not sure it quite gets there. In fact, Los Angeles is a recurring motif in this book, and yet I'm not sure that the book actually paints a specific or unique picture of LA from one artist's perspective. In this poem in particular, I'm left asking, why does LA leave its people as amputees? Why are the body parts still running around and chasing their bodies? Granted, I'm glad that the poem encourages questions that lead to a deeper meaning rather than creating questions that cause confusion. The words transplants and amputated are strong, especially with their double meanings. People literally do have a lot of work done in show business. Hair transplants, body augmentations and modifications, etc. and so forth. And while male celebrities certainly aren't exempt from such things, especially hair transplants, I would argue that the pressure is that much stronger on women given the patriarchy we live in. There's a constant pressure for women to maintain their youth, and they often face ridicule for doing so. Ridicule from the same system that pressures them to look a certain way. It's neat that Diamandis can touch on these ideas. Even so, I long for more creative imagery and more vivid descriptions to really bring the creative premise home. Okay, those are about all the individual poems that I thought were worth mentioning. Sorry if I sounded like a broken record. Let's get into some general and overall thoughts. First, just to point out something that annoys me, this book has no page numbers. Okay, that's not true. The book does have page numbers, but they don't pop up until page 14, and even after that point, they're not on every page. It's weirdly inconsistent how they're interspersed throughout. I guess I'm glad there are at least some, but it's weird that they're not constant. Like many celebrity collections, this one is largely concerned with aesthetics, and the page numbers are a casualty of that concern. That said, I think this book's visual flair is noteworthy. The artist credited in the acknowledgments is Dominique Falcone, and a brief glance at her work reveals what is, in my opinion, some standout pieces. In a Q&A on the book, Diamandis said she wanted the images accompanying the poems to feel loud as a representation of the time in her life she was writing about. This was also a big influencing factor on the chosen cover. Going back to the poetry, some of the big ideas explored throughout the collection include loneliness, a loss of identity, the relationships between men and women, men who wield power over women, and the effects of a fame-obsessed society. How well does the material explore these big ideas? Well, I think I made my opinion on that matter pretty clear. As with many songwriter collections, there are some pretty good rhymes in here, but also some lackluster ones. I at least appreciate that Diamandis is generally writing longer poems in this collection. It's so easy for celebrities to fill their collections with obviously low-effort, shorter work. And that's not to say all of these poems read as high effort, but at least they don't go by in a blip. There's still at least a little something to latch onto in each piece, however briefly, perhaps with the exception of a couple of the pieces I showed. On the other hand, I feel a lot of the poems kind of distill their essence too obviously, whether at the end or in the middle of the piece. I might actually be interested in seeing what Diamandis could write if she bound herself to a stricter form or meter. While the poems do often rhyme, I don't think they're actually working with any specific constraints. There's a poem called Sex Robot, which I think exemplifies what I'm talking about. It would benefit either from a specific form or a lack thereof. I think I would have preferred it if it had been completely free verse. That way Diamandis could have gotten her points across better. That poem, by the way, is available in the Google preview of the book if you'd like to read it. Diamandis also says some interesting things about process. In the book's introduction, she writes, "One hot summer night, after taking psilocybin, my mind began to write intricate, strange stories drawn from memories old and recent. At first, I thought they were songs, so I tried to box them into their usual structures, but they refused to obey. They seemed to want to expand and unfurl into their own shapes, so I realized that they were poems, not songs, and from that moment onward, my love for this new medium was born. I had found a new way to confess, process, and play with the past." I enjoy when poets discuss their process, no matter how experienced they are with the medium. Personally, I believe in the idea that a poem finds its form as the poet writes it. There are some poems onto which you can't force a form. It's cool to see Diamandis discover this from the lens of a songwriter, even if her poems are rather lacking for me. In that Q&A, Diamandis talked a little more about process. Like many poets, she expresses that poetry was the best way to convey these particular feelings, which is great. I love when people get into poetry because they recognize that it has a certain power that other mediums don't always have. It's also interesting to hear a songwriter talk about their different approaches to songwriting and poetry. Diamandis says the poems in the book felt even more vulnerable and revealing than her songs, and she never thought any of the poems might become song lyrics. She strictly thought of them as poems. She also mentions she never tried to sing her poetry nor speak it out loud. This is more personal preference, but I think there's a big advantage to speaking your poetry aloud as you're writing and revising it. I think you get a better idea of what is and isn't working on the page by hearing it, and I know I'm not the only poet who thinks so. But also, Diamandis says she never considered anyone reading the poems as she was writing them. Personally, I think if you're writing with the intention of being published, you kind of have to consider your audience. There's obviously a place for poetry that's just meant for you. I'm not sure if that place is in a published for-sale collection, but I'll let all of you deliberate on that one. Sometimes poems that are meant to be personal end up reaching a lot of people. The near entirety of Emily Dickinson's work comes to mind as an example. But put a pin in this question, we'll come back to it in a second. As for poetic influences, this will not surprise many of you, but Diamandis names Rupi Kaur in the Q&A. She praises Kaur for doing something new and refreshing with the craft and for disrupting a field that is traditionally dominated by straight men. And look, I agree that Kaur disrupts the form, but like some of Diamandis' choices in her book, I would actually argue she's not doing so in a new or interesting way. I don't need to beat that dead horse, of course. In this Q&A, Diamandis also explains her thoughts on form, saying,
I think playing with format is such a satisfying thing for me, but also you read and absorb it differently in the way that you arrange the poem on a page.
And broadly, I agree with this. Even well-chosen line breaks have that effect. Still, I repeat, I don't think Diamandis is doing anything very new or interesting with her formatting decisions. In fact, in a lot of instances, it just feels kind of gimmicky. But I agree that poetry is and should be for everyone, regardless of race, gender, or sexual orientation. In the acknowledgements, Diamandis also mentions Eve Babbitt's and Dorothy Parker as influences. As per the Poetry Foundation, Parker's poetry was often dismissed as light or flapper verse. And while a lot of her poems certainly do seem comedic first and foremost, just as the Poetry Foundation says, her work subtly says quite a bit about power dynamics, depression, and gender. Here's a Parker poem that I find particularly effective. For a Lady Who Must Write Verse. Unto 70 years and 7 hide your double birthright well, you that are the brat of heaven and the pampered heir to hell. Let your rhymes be tinsel treasures, strung and seen and thrown aside. Drill your apt and docile measures sternly as you drill your pride. Show your quick, alarming skill in tidy mockeries of art. Never, never dip your quill in ink that rushes from your heart. When your pain must come to paper, see it dust before the day. Let your nightlight curl and caper, let it lick the words away. Never print, poor child, a lay on love and tears and anguishing, lest a cooled, benignant Phaon murmur, silly little thing. There's a lot of great stuff to unpack here, but most interesting of all to me is perhaps the allusion to Phaon. For those unaware, Greek drama purports that Phaon was given an ointment by Aphrodite that made him young and beautiful. This, in turn, made Sappho fall for him. She would eventually throw herself over a cliff in the face of her anguished love. Most historians actually assert that Sappho died of old age, though that's not certain. There's a lot packed into that allusion. The poem is clearly about the way men tend to denigrate and devalue art from women and women who are artists. And believe me, the irony is not lost on me in saying that. Put a pin in that thought too. As such, the speaker of the poem warns female poets to guard their hearts. The speaker of the poem tells female poets to never be too sincere or emotional. As the third stanza says, never, never dip your quill in ink that rushes from your heart. And going back to the allusion, I feel it's very telling that Parker chose the man who supposedly made the foundational lesbian poet fall for him. Talk about the erasure of a woman's feelings, you know what I mean? Again, at the risk of being ironic here, I'm just not sure Diamandis gets this clever or artful with her attempts at commentary on gender. Of course, feel free to disagree with me. Before getting to my final points, I also want to showcase Diamandis' words on the process of working with an editor.
I mean, there was an editor at Penguin, but they kind of give you all these notes. It is slightly horrifying actually at the beginning, because you're like, you've destroyed my book. But then they always say, you don't have to take any of this. It's just a suggestion. And there were a couple of things that I changed, but for the most part, it was just what I had wanted to write.
Okay, first I want to say we obviously don't know what the writing or editing process looked like on this book. All we have is the final product. We can only wonder what kind of notes Diamandis received and which she kept. Second, I want to say that getting feedback and criticism on any writing, especially personal poetry, is difficult. But with both those acknowledgements, I do feel it's a little bit telling that Marina says the editor was destroying her book with their notes. Maybe that was only her initial perspective and she came around to thinking about it in a different way. Who can say for sure? I don't know though. I would think Diamandis would know that creating art in any form requires some humility and willingness to accept notes, no? Listen, I want to acknowledge that I kind of always enter these celebrity poetry books with low expectations and a negative bias, just given the track record of most celebrity collections. But as I was reading this book, I couldn't help but wonder if I was being especially hard on Marina. It was actually somewhat relieving to find out that a lot of Diamandis' own fans didn't like this book either. This Reddit post from January 2025 expresses disappointment with the collection, while a commenter on the post alleges that most of the posts and comments on the singer's subreddit regarded the book as cringe and bad. Personally, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's cringe, but maybe that's just because I'm a poetry defender in general. I think, like a lot of Core's work, people might feel it's cringe because it's very plain and overstated in its sentiments. But in any case, Diamandis' fans still wanted to support her. They still bought the book because they were glad to see her branching out. And as the OP on this post wrote, Diamandis has potential. I think that's true for all aspiring poets. The OP also wrote, "The thing about poetry versus writing song lyrics is that the latter is more or less a natural gift and the former is a talent that needs to be developed." Now, personally, I disagree that songwriting is a natural gift, and I think there are also people who do display natural talent when it comes to poetry. That said, I think with any art form, no matter how good you might naturally be, there absolutely needs to be a development that takes place. As I've said so many times, if you want to be a good poet, you have to read a lot of poetry, and you have to write a lot of poetry. Diamandis' songwriting career certainly gave her some advantages when approaching this collection, but as she herself pointed out, writing poetry is a different process from writing lyrics. As with pretty much all of the celebrities I read, I hope Diamandis continues to read and write. I hope she inspires other people to do the same. And while I don't want to discount anything I've said so far, I do want to end on some words from Diamandis.
Because my art is for me, and then the world that I build around it is for my fan base to enjoy. So that's always been like the thing that has propelled me.
At the end of the day, Marina's art is for her. Some of the best writing advice I've ever received is to write whatever it is you want to read. And maybe that feels contrary to what I said about the consideration of an audience, but I would argue the two pieces of advice go hand in hand. You are your primary audience, and odds are there are people out there who really aren't so different from you. If you don't want to read what it is you're writing, why would anybody else? And chances are, if you don't want to read it, it won't be fun to write in the first place. And what's the point of writing if you're not having any fun doing it? Of course, not every second of writing can be fun, but you know what I mean. One final disclaimer though. Just because Diamandis wrote the book she wanted to, doesn't mean it necessarily justifies itself economically. As I've said before on this channel, artists have to be very self-aware when it comes to the price of their art. At the time of writing this video, the book is $14.60 on Amazon for a hardcover, which is way more reasonable than most all of the celebrity collections I've looked at before, but that's marked down from $24. Still a better deal than some celebrity poetry collections, but I don't know. As this commenter says, we should be very aware of what celebrities try to sell us. I'll turn it over to all of you. What did you think of the poetry you saw here? What did you think of Diamandis' thoughts and my own? Have you read the book? What are your thoughts on it? Please, tell me everything. And hey, before you go, take a look at this poem. This is a piece from one of my patrons who goes by Mad Charlotte. I scoped a woman named Qualia. Seems my first kill was boxed in by window panes. Me, I couldn't begin to describe what I'd read. Her body's various wiggles, doomed to meaningless squiggles, symbolic, said, life, a tween born, dead. For the chance to submit one of your pieces at the end of my videos, or if you just like what I do here and want to support me, you can consider donating to my Patreon too. For just $3 a month, you'll get to see videos early, receive access to the community Discord, and hear my thoughts on the books I've been reading each month. You're seeing my patrons' names on screen right now, and I truly can't thank them enough. If you want to support the channel in other important ways, all the algorithm stuff really helps a lot. Liking, commenting, subscribing, hyping, meeting Merman on Hinge, that sort of thing. You can also follow me on my socials if you want, but no matter what, keep reading, keep writing, and ultimately, keep in mind, this is a rough draft. And for sticking around till the end of the video, have a writing prompt. For this prompt, I've pulled 10 words from the poems I've shown in this video. Your prompt today is to write a poem of your own using at least 5 of these words. Or, if you want to be so bold, you can challenge yourself to use all 10 of them. Here is the list of words: Starlight, eraser, apple, fizz, underwater, spinning, factory, gumball, salinate, amputated. Again, your task is to write a poem using at least 5 of these words, or more if you so choose. So, it's your turn now. Get to writing.